The following is a podcast about giftedness and other brain stuff. You can support it by sharing it with everyone you know who has a brain. Thank you.
Welcome to the Mind.
What do we really mean by genius?
Matters.
Giftedness is so much more than an academic label.
Podcast.
We tend to think of gifted as kids being good at everything across the board.
An exploration of giftedness.
Originals are nonconformists.
Creativity.
People who not only have new ideas.
Intelligence.
They're the people you want to bet on.
In childhood.
I like to learn about things, but I like to learn my way.
And beyond. This is the Mind Matters Podcast.
Hi, I'm Emily Kircher-Morris. Thanks for listening to episode 12 of Mind Matters. So, fair warning, things might get a little intense today. We'll be talking about emotional intensity. The emotional intensity of gifted people can be higher than their neurotypical peers, and we're going to talk about that today with Christine Fonseca. People with high emotional intensity often react more strongly to their emotions like anger, sadness, disappointment, and even love. That intensity is often misunderstood by others. But when an emotionally intense person learns coping and management skills, their intensity can be a gift. All about emotional intensity on this episode of Mind Matters. A shout out to our new friends on social media. The latest platform we've joined is Instagram. You can follow us there. Our handle on Instagram and also on Facebook is Mind Matters Podcast. On Twitter, we're at Mind Matters Pod. We try to participate in groups and chats whenever we can, so be sure to let us know about your social media group or your chat by tagging us or sending us a message. We've got a lot of really exciting guests coming up on our future episodes, covering a lot of the subjects you've asked us about. If you have suggestions for guests or topics, message us on social media, or you can reach out through our website, which is mindmatterspodcast.com. Just one more thing before we bring on our guest. Podcast apps like iTunes, Stitcher, Pocket Casts, and others often use subscription numbers or listener ratings to decide who they feature. Being featured can be a real boost to a podcast, reaching more people through that extra exposure. So, if you take just one quick minute and hit subscribe and give us a thumbs up or a positive rating when you have the chance, we'd appreciate it very much. Our guest today is Christine Fonseca. Christine currently works as a consultant. She works with school districts to support the behavioral and social emotional needs of students. She also coaches children and parents to work through their anxieties, and she's the author of the book Emotional Intensity in Gifted Students, published by Proofrock Press. This book has been a great resource for many families and teachers. It was first published in 2008 and was updated as a second edition in 2016. Christine Fonseca, next.
On a recent episode of Mind Matters.
I was the typical gifted kid perfectionist, not wanting to play with toys, but rather just organize them. I watched an episode of Hoarders with my husband. The woman being interviewed said, "Well, I'm a perfectionist." To my husband, that made no sense whatsoever. How could she be a perfectionist? And I understood completely, because sometimes perfectionism manifests itself in this complete throwing in of the towel.
Would you say that perfectionism is inherently a negative quality or a negative trait to be overcome? Are there instances where it can be viewed in a more positive way?
So you've asked the most controversial question among academicians researching perfectionism.
That's episode 6, available at mindmatterspodcast.com or wherever you get your podcasts. This is the Mind Matters Podcast.
Emotional intensity is a part of neurodiversity that drives things like joy, love, passion for hobbies, romantic relationships, some of the most meaningful parts of our lives. Gifted people often experience a higher level of it than their neurotypical peers. Today we're taking a deep dive into emotional intensity, and if you Google it, today's guest will show up in the results.
Hi there, I'm Christine Fonseca, the author of Emotional Intensity in Gifted Students, and I'm happy to be here.
Your book was originally published when I first began my counseling and family therapy program, which was about 2008, and it was really influential in helping drive my specialization and the area that I knew I wanted to work with. So I'm curious, what were some of the things that prompted you to want to write this book in the first place?
Wow. Well, first off, thank you for your kind words. There's so many things that went into me deciding that this was a book that really had to be written. I think it started really with my own children and noticing in both of my children who are both gifted that they had this huge emotional world going on that I really didn't understand that well. And I can remember early in my career as a school psychologist, I was asked to teach a parenting class specifically for parents of gifted kids. It was part of a grant that the school had gotten. And I immediately said yes at that opportunity just to give me an excuse to research it more. And I found when I was doing the research, this was, back in, like 2005 or earlier, there just wasn't a lot out there for parents to really understand this emotional nature of giftedness. It was, I felt like there was this intensity that was just running through my kids, running through the kids of all the gifted kids we knew through school. There was just all of the parents talked about it, but there were just no resources in layman terms that were easily accessible for parents. And so I started teaching this class, and the class was really popular, and I was asked to write a book about the class multiple times. And then finally, in about 2008, 2009, I sat down and decided to write this book. And I wanted it to be a book that parents could turn to, not just when things were good, but more importantly, when things were rough in the house, and be able to just be this friendly book that they could turn to and get some advice from. And I wanted it to feel like we were sitting at a coffee shop having a conversation. And so that's what I sought out to write.
I personally have purchased multiple copies because I keep giving them to people and they don't give them back to me. And so they want to keep them. And so it really is a great resource for families. And I think it also normalizes a lot for families who are trying to sit there and looking at their kids and going, what is going on with this? Why, is my kid acting this way or feeling this way?
That was definitely one of the goals, was to normalize that behavior and help people understand that from my perspective and the research that I've done and the thousands literally of gifted children and parents that I've spoken with, it is normal. This comes along for the ride. This is just part of what it means to be gifted.
So how do you define emotional intensity? What does that term mean exactly to you?
So emotional intensity is feeling the full range of human emotion at like Mach 10. So that means you're going to be super happy, or you might be super sad, or more often than not, you're fluctuating between super happy and super sad so fast that your parents need like a scorecard just to figure out where you're at any given moment. I have a dear friend who describes it as living life as though you are painting the world in bold colors while everybody around you is painting in pastels. And I think that's really speaks to the heart of what this emotional intensity is.
How is giftedness and emotional intensity related? And why are there so many gifted individuals who have this emotional intensity?
So first off, I would argue that it is a defining feature of giftedness. So in my, looking at the world and the people I've interviewed, with very, very few exceptions, it's just part of what it means to be gifted. I look at giftedness kind of like a coin. So on one side of the coin, we have cognitive intensity, which is the thing where we think about with giftedness most frequently. It's that high intellectual ability and that fast thinking and that deep problem solving. But on the other side of the exact same coin, we have this thing called emotional intensity, which is every bit as intense as the intellectual intensity, except it involves our emotions. More recently, they've done really good research neurologically to show that our gifted brains are actually a little different than non-gifted brains. We have increased levels of gray matter and white matter, both of which contribute to the emotional intensity that we see. The parts of our brain that process our sensory information are more finely tuned, which also relates to this area of emotional intensity. And our brain's capacity to be efficient, to build increased neural pathways and communication between all of the processing areas within the brain structure is also highly developed, which also leads to, quite frankly, more emotionality because of the way everything is kind of blending together. and being utilized. So there's lots of biological reasons why it goes hand in hand with giftedness. It's an area of intensity that's been identified way back before in the 30s, before we were even doing brain research, through Dabrowski and Dabrowski's identification of areas of overexcitability. Emotional was one of them. And in all of the research more recently, it's just one of the most consistent factors or attributes that shows up with giftedness.
What are some of the strengths that come along with it? And then, with the flip side of that, what are some of the struggles that you see?
So I'm actually going to talk about the struggles first, because I think it's the thing that most people can relate to. So when you're an incredibly intense, emotionally intense human, you tend to feel everything at Mach 10. So you feel everything in this really deep, profound way. But when you're young, you don't yet have tools in your emotional toolbox to process through all of that. So because of your heightened intellectual capacity and your heightened awareness around the world, you may see injustice in the world, for example, and it will affect you really profoundly, to the point of drawing really big emotions. And you might start kind of drowning in that emotional place, not knowing how you can help. And the world feels very big and maybe even very scary. And what happens is we start acting out from that place without having good tools to kind of deal with that huge emotionality. And so it comes out as anger or aggression or frustration or anxiety. And then oftentimes we get labeled very quickly that we're actually one of those things. So we're having an anxiety attack or a panic attack or those kinds of things. And then we start defining this emotionality as being abnormal, not realizing that for us, gifted individuals, it's actually completely normal. On the flip side, in terms of a positive thing, I like to look at that emotionality as our secret superpower, actually. So I think feeling things that deeply enable us to feel a level of passion about those areas that we're really interested in. And that passion then fuels motivation so that we can actually enact change or accomplish the things we want to accomplish. Philosophically, I think there's nothing on the planet that gets created without really large amounts of passion, because that passion enables us to get over barriers that all of us encounter when we're trying to create something. And so people who have this high emotionality, this emotional intensity, are very well equipped to kind of go achieve great things or go create profound things in their areas of interest that can be really life-affirming and life-changing. So I see it as a superpower. I think when we're young, and even sometimes when we're older and just overwhelmed, it can be hard because we can get really overwhelmed and life can feel like it's going too fast and it's just too much. But we can just learn coping strategies that can really help us learn to process all of that. And so to me, the emotional intensity is never the issue. Sometimes our coping strategies are the issue. They're just not there sometimes to handle the overwhelm that we might feel.
I find that the adults in the kids' lives a lot of times don't really understand it. So I can think of one particular client, and she, when you talk about those injustices in the world, she was kind of the classic example of this existential depression. She was very concerned about people who are homeless and who don't have enough money, and people, throughout the world. I think this was, I was talking to her at the time that everything was happening in Syria, and she felt like she had a very hard time understanding how this could be happening over there and how did she deserve to be over here. It was just like this whole thought process that she was going into, and it was so strong. And her family and they're kind of saying, well, just don't worry about it. And it's like, well,
yeah, that doesn't work.
But the flip side of that was this passion and this drive where she really wanted to do something. And, she was given some supports and was able to do that. And I think that empowered her to then kind of harness that and make some changes. And it flipped it from being a diagnosis of anxiety and depression to being able to manage it, because it was really just surrounding those emotions and not knowing how to handle them and not knowing where to go with it.
I've been blessed to work with a lot of students through my career as a school psychologist before I went into private practice. students who were gifted, but when they darkened my doorstep, when I got involved, the giftedness wasn't known yet, typically. Usually they're coming to see me because they're in a program for students with very significant emotional concerns, or they're really complex cases, and so I get called in on it. The team that's working with them are thinking, various different mental health disorders or autism or other kinds of things, and they're not necessarily having the understanding of what giftedness is. And so I've been blessed to be able to, meet these kids that are just struggling in really profound ways, only to find out that, here we've got a twice exceptional kid, a kid who's gifted and can't read, or a kid who's gifted and on the autism spectrum, or various other kinds of things. And because the giftedness was never seen, we were very busy trying to treat something we thought was broken without ever realizing that this isn't about a broken human.
Right.
This is about a gifted human who also has some other things that are interfering with their ability to harness those gifts.
And I think also sometimes it's not just about fixing it. It's about building that understanding for the individual and for the family.
Yes.
And being able to help kids and teens learn about it for themselves.
Yes.
Some self-disclosure about myself as a kid. I was pretty much a hot mess. And I remember being in third grade and... I don't know if I should say this, but...
Go for it. I probably have a similar story.
But going back and feeling just so distressed about something that happened with friends, or feeling like I had been, I was super competitive and perfectionistic. So if I didn't win, a competition or whatever, and going back in the back of the classroom and sitting in the little library area and just crying, being so embarrassed. And then the kids would kind of make fun of me for that as well. And I just couldn't even get it together. And I think now, if I were that teacher and I saw that kid, I would think there was really something wrong.
Totally.
But I just could not. I didn't have the vocabulary. I also didn't really have anybody who I felt like would listen. And, I think that's also obviously something that has driven me into the field just because of those personal experiences.
Interesting story. So before I really knew what direction I wanted to take emotional intensity in terms of a book, I can distinctly remember sitting at a little table in the kitchen in one of my parents' house with my mom. My mom was an incredibly gifted woman as well. And I remember asking her if she ever had moments in her life where she felt a little bipolar. And, was that something that maybe ran through her family, or was it something else altogether? And it was really from that conversation that I began to understand this thing called emotional intensity at this real personal kind of, feral level, and how it had played out in my life. And what I was really talking about were these intense moments that would fluctuate, that I was keenly aware of. And, it wasn't something that rose to the level of bipolar, but man, it sure felt like it sometimes. And what do I do about that? And did other people feel that way? And so when I started conducting focus groups for the follow-up book to Emotional Intensity, which is 101 Success Secrets, which was basically the exact same book as Emotional Intensity, only it's written for kids. I interviewed over 1,000 kids for that book, and it was a theme that just kept coming up. And so part of my message when I went out and spoke with groups was, we have to help normalize things for these kids. These kids, whether we tell them anything or not, are keenly aware of the fact that they feel differently than their peers. And if we don't interfere with that, if we don't have a conversation with them and help them understand the truth of what's going on, they're going to label themselves as broken. And perception, your brain operates based on your perception. If you decide you're broken, your brain's going to function accordingly. And why would we want that? Why do we want to kill off talent in that way? Why do we want to hurt people in that way? And so it really became a mission of mine to talk about this emotional intensity and how do we redefine it, and how do we not approach people like they're broken? How do we treat this as a matter of coping strategies and learning to understand what your emotional nuances are so that you can plan accordingly?
Emotional intensity manifests itself in all aspects of a person's life, but one of the first places it's noticed is at school.
There is an intensity around perfectionism that can be tied to emotional intensity, as well as some other things. So that kid who has to do it right, who can't, there's one red spot on the page from the teacher and they'll hyper focus on that mistake and use that to define themselves. They may shut down or develop what looks on the outside to be social anxiety disorder. They may kind of show up in that way. Being really hesitant to perform in class or kind of withdraw from class in some ways. They also might engage in aggressive behaviors. So if you're dealing with a gifted human who maybe also has some trauma or maybe also has some other things going on, that could definitely come out as extreme aggression. My experience, though, more often than not, is that they don't always show anything at school, that they look fine at school, where it happens at home. And so these are the kids who are blowing up at home like crazy, so much so that the parents are just beside themselves. They go to the school for help, and the school looks at them like they have three heads because the kid's fine at school. And so then there's all of this kind of implication that, no, it's just how you're parenting, or it's this or that or the other. And there's not an understanding that, no, the kid has a great public mask that they wear and cling to. Mm-hmm. They feel safe in that environment. They no longer need to wear that mask. All that emotionality comes out. And it can come out as rage. It can look like a mood disorder. It can look like extreme depression. And then you couple that with some existential moments that these kids have that their lives are punctuated by. And it can be very scary for the parent as they're wondering, oh my gosh, is my kid suicidal? Is my kid, what's going to happen? How's my kid ever going to function? And then parents start feeling bad because they're like, what am I doing? The kid never does this at school. It must be something I'm doing. And it just unravels and becomes a bit of a mess.
I have clients who come to me either who've been with other counselors or whatever, but when it only manifests at home, it's like, oh, it's oppositional defiant disorder.
Yeah.
I almost always immediately go, okay, well, let's look at this a little more closely, because I almost always feel like there's something else that's really happening there in that situation.
Oh, totally.
How can parents and teachers approach talking to kids about their emotional intensity?
I think in general, we just need to start talking about what it means to be gifted with kids, Like we can't just have kids take some screening test, give them some label and call it a day and never have a conversation with them, which I think happens all the time.
Right.
And kids grow up starting to think that, I was gifted in elementary school, but I'm not gifted in secondary ed, which just always makes me laugh, and those kinds of things. So I think it's really important to just have an honest conversation about what it means to be, have this label, whatever you want to call it, right? What does that mean? And really take it from the perspective of you just approach the world differently. Not good or bad, just different. And so you can't compare yourself because you're comparing apples to oranges. And it becomes this really unfair comparison to everybody involved. And part of that conversation then needs to also be around the emotional aspects of this and what that's going to mean. You are going to feel really deeply about some things, and that's okay. And if you find yourself overwhelmed by those feelings, that's when it's time to develop some new coping skills. It's a sign to you that there are some coping strategies that just aren't serving you. Or maybe you don't have enough, or maybe you need to go deeper with them.
Sometimes when you approach a child about their emotions, they don't want to address them because it reignites them again, and they'd prefer to avoid that feeling. Often younger kids don't have the level of emotional literacy to describe what they're feeling. So we have to help them process those emotions.
One of the techniques I use with kids a lot, and I actually use it with adults too when they're particularly blocked, is this idea of developing an internal persona. And through the persona, you can deal with all the stuff. So if you're not ready to go there personally, you can create your own little, mini-me inside and let that person start doing the work. And sometimes that's a lot easier for anybody because it doesn't feel so close. It doesn't feel so personal. It enables you to still have a little bit of distance from it until you're ready to just grapple with whatever it is you're grappling with on a personal level.
So give me an example. What type of persona are we talking about?
The example I give when I'm training adults on this is I have my evil twin whose name is Drusilla. And Drusilla, if I'm really struggling with somebody, I'll lovingly refer to Drusilla. Drusilla's really struggling with this right now. And it's usually, if I say it that way, it's because there's someplace I can't quite go yet. With kids, we'll develop a whole thing. It might be a superhero. It might be a supervillain that's living in your brain. It's really taking some of the work of Michelle Winner, who did some work with autism in Superflex, and it's really using that same idea, but using it in a slightly different way. So with Superflex, it was really about providing for students with autism who one of their fundamental features is that inability to really self-reflect in a really profound way. It's just part of what it means to be autistic, and give them a tool or a mechanism by which they can do that, and they can do that pretty well. This is the exact same idea, but you can do it with all kids. And so you can create, I have an exercise in a different book where the idea for the person going through the book, it's for kids, is to literally, here's a character interview this inner persona. Really get to know them, give them a name, give them character traits, draw a picture about them. And then when you're filling out some of these worksheets, these cognitive-based kind of worksheets to maybe, reframe your thinking or any of that, if you're struggling to do it personally, have your character do it instead. Do it from the point of view of the character and see if you can't make some headway. And I will find almost always, with very few exceptions, we can make headway when we're doing it from the perspective of the character.
It gives it a little bit of distance. It makes it not quite so personal.
And not so scary.
So now let's bring it home and talk about mom, dad, and family.
Well, the first thing with the parent is the parent needs to do their own internal work. What I find happens a lot is with gifted children, one or both parents is also gifted and usually unidentified. So they don't know. And so part of what's happening in the household is the emotional intensity of one is triggering the emotional intensity of the other, which is why it often feels like World War III going on when it's bad. And so the parent is really the person in the house who's probably got the best ability to manage their emotions, or at least oftentimes that's true. They have more tools in their toolbox. So I usually start with the parent learning to recognize when the parent is getting triggered, so that the parent can employ some self-care skills to be able to regulate their own emotions, and then detach as necessary, and giving parents permission to remove themselves from a situation, even if the kid's drawing them in, but giving themselves permission to regroup and teaching them how to do that. So that's probably the first most important thing. And then after that, we talk a lot when I work with parents about scripts. So what's a good script that you can refer to when your kid's pushing all your buttons that alerts your kid to the fact that they are spinning? They're locked in their emotional intensity, and they're not in a good place. And so we literally used to use the word spinning for one of my daughters because she reminded me of the Tasmanian devil. So I used to say that she was spinning. And I would just tell her that you're spinning and I need you to go sit in your room and calm yourself a little bit until you're ready to stop spinning and we can kind of move forward. And she would go reluctantly. None of this was easy for her. She certainly didn't respond on the first prompt to that. But because we were dogged about it and talked openly about emotions in our household and all of that, there came a point in her teens when she was able to regulate in the sense of being able to remove herself from the situation and just catch herself and say, I'm starting to spin. I'm going to get really angry. I don't want to say something I don't want to say, don't mean. I'm just going to remove myself. And I'll tell you, there's no better day than the first day you hear that out of your kid's mouth.
That is a milestone for sure.
It is a huge one, yeah. And so I just, it's about being super persistent. And one of the things I tell parents all the time is parenting's the least efficient job you'll ever have in your entire life. You will have to repeat everything ad nauseum way more than you think you're going to have to. You'll have to change techniques way more frequently than you think you're going to have to. And you just need to know that going in, so that when it happens, you don't catastrophize it, make it something that it's not. This is just normal. It's because human beings don't like to change. We don't like to adjust. We only do it when we have to. And so part of that is just knowing that and knowing what it means to be human and knowing what the brain's really trying to do. And so I find in working with parents, the more that they can understand this and come to this from that knowledge place instead of from an emotional place, the more quickly you can de-escalate a situation and have an increased amount of times that are working really well versus those times when it's a little chaotic.
Gifted kids need novelty, which sometimes leaves parents, teachers, and counselors struggling to find new ways to help. What works today might be basically useless tomorrow or next month or next year. And that's okay. You've got to give yourself the flexibility to change and also keep some reasonable expectations in place. Controlling emotional intensity is not an overnight process.
Part of a child's greatest asset is that intellect and tapping into that intellectual ability. And part of their Achilles heel is that intellect and that, constant self-rationalization of why whatever somebody's telling you is wrong, no matter what it is. And that immediate, my daughter puts it really well. My oldest actually does also deal with a true, biologically based anxiety in addition to her emotional intensity. And so she describes it beautifully. She says that her brain is super smart, and because of that, it adjusts. So every time she's getting a handle on kind of those false messages from her brain shifts and does something a little bit different.
Right.
So she feels like she's playing whack-a-mole sometimes and trying to get a handle on it all. And she goes, my brain's too smart, it just adjusts. And I said, yes, because this was a survival instinct of yours, and your brain's going to fight you tooth and nail to keep it in place. What your brain's not understanding is that there's no need for it right now. And that's what you have to work on.
There's really no perfect time to deal with that emotional intensity. And, it can be different with every child. When do you think it should be the top priority?
So we, and what I recommend to families that I work with is deal with the giftedness first, really make sure that the needs of the gifted student are being met. So what do I mean by that? That they're academically being met, that that intellectual piece is being met, that they have peers that they can relate to, that they have a support system that they can relate to, that they're fully in touch with their giftedness as much as possible, commensurate to age. And then if you're still seeing behaviors that are interfering with daily functioning, if it's still at that level, then it's time to seek professional help outside of the family, and just make sure that the person you're utilizing is somebody who's very familiar with giftedness.
Emotional intensity, like a lot of other aspects of neurodiversity, is not binary. It exists on a curve, and emotionally intense people each experience it differently. There really is no norm.
More than anything, I want us to redefine this idea of emotional intensity away from a negative thing, which is, unfortunately, even with some authors who work with gifted humans and write a lot of books in the gifted area, there's still a lot of terminology that makes it abnormal, like there's something wrong. And so that's my message. I want to redefine all of that. I want us to really embrace emotional intensity like the superpower that it is. I want us to understand that it gives a depth of passion and compassion in a world that desperately needs it. It gives a level of empathy in a world that desperately needs it. And I want us to start celebrating it and grooming it and helping kids use it to do the great things that they may want to do.
Christine Fonseca is an author of books on giftedness and emotional intensity. You can learn more about her work at ChristineFonseca.com. Thanks for being here.
Thank you. It's been my pleasure.
More thoughts on emotional intensity coming up on the Mind Matters podcast.
To reach the Mind Matters podcast, go to our website, mindmatterspodcast.com, and click on Contact. Follow us on Twitter @MindMattersPod, on Facebook Mind Matters Podcast, or you can reach our YouTube channel through our website.
Emotional intensity coupled with intellectual intensity can be, intense. As parents and teachers, when we see traits of emotional intensity in our gifted youth, we need to examine that behavior through the lens of giftedness. What is it in their world that is causing this dysregulation? Are they struggling with perfectionism, existential depression, or struggles with same-age peer relationships? How can we help them learn to identify these emotions and self-regulate? How can we ensure that they are not punished for being differently wired? How can we help these kids embrace their intensity and use it to power them forward to success? From the child who is easily tearful when they make a mistake, to the kid who explodes in anger at a perceived injustice, to the student who appears hyper because they can't manage their excitement. Emotional intensity takes a lot of different forms. These students feel their emotions deeply and can have trouble containing their reactions. Because of the way they are viewed by our society, Ross Greene calls the kids who react in ways that elicit sympathy lucky, and the ones who appear aggressive or out of control unlucky. Ultimately, the behavior these kids exhibit is simply a way of communicating. They're saying, I feel overwhelmed and I don't know what to do. By developing coping skills, such as emotional literacy, perspective taking, and mindfulness, we can provide the tools they need to manage this intensity. Many of you may also recognize these traits in yourself. Giftedness and emotional intensity don't evaporate once someone graduates from high school. Emotionally intense gifted children grow into emotionally intense gifted adults. So what skills have you learned to cope with your emotional intensity? If you find yourself seeking connection with other emotionally intense adults, you may find camaraderie in Christine's Facebook group, The Intense Life Tribe. And know that there is power in intensity. We just have to find a way to harness it. I'm Emily Kircher-Morris. See you next time.
Well, you know what they say. There are no kingdoms without rulers. Are you ready for change? We could be kings and queens every day. On the low, we are brave. Yes, even braver than the bravest. So let's go, start the race. We should be kings and queens every day. You've been trying to find your crown, happy camper through the ups and downs, keeping calm, winning ground. Let's build castles now. We'll make gold on our way up, through them trees before we reach them tops. Oh no, half isn't enough. Let's build castles now. Well, you know what they say. There are no kingdoms without rulers. Are you ready for change? We could be kings and queens every day.
Thanks for listening to the Mind Matters podcast with Emily Kircher-Morris. To learn more about us and our mission, go to mindmatterspodcast.com. If you'd like to show your support for Mind Matters, find us in Apple iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. Subscribe and leave us a positive review. Start a discussion and follow us on Twitter at MindMattersPod or on Facebook at facebook.com/MindMattersPodcast. Mind Matters is a production of Morris Creative Services.